Absolute power doesn't protect you from a savage roast. You can conquer the world, command armies, and build empires, but history might still remember you as the cabbage or the slobberer. Today we are exposing 32 rulers who wanted to be legendary but ended up being punchlines. From dictators destroyed by acne to emperors named after bathroom accidents, this is the side of history they desperately tried to hide. 1. Imagine you are about to become the king of Germany. The nobles arrive to give you the crown, expecting to find you sharpening a sword or wrestling a bear. Instead, they find Henry I knee-deep in a meadow, obsessively fixing his bird-catching nets. That is right. The man was so distracted by his feathery hobby that history literally named him Henry the Fowler. It sounds like a bad sitcom character, but this guy actually built the medieval German state. He was a brilliant strategist and a serious ruler. Yet, because he was caught playing with bird traps one single time when destiny knocked on his door, he is forever immortalized as the guy who really liked catching pigeons. Talk about a first impression that sticks. 2. Dictators usually want names like the Iron Fist or the Supreme Leader. Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega got stuck with Cara de Pina, which translates to the majestic title of Pineapple Face. Why? Well, the man had severe acne scars that gave his skin a distinct bumpy texture resembling the tropical fruit. It sounds childish, but this was actually a masterstroke of psychological warfare by his opponents. It is incredibly hard to be terrified of a tyrant when you are staring at him and thinking about a pina colada. It stripped away his mystique and turned a feared strongman into a walking produce aisle joke. Nothing deflates an ego quite like realizing your entire nation calls you a prickly fruit behind your back. 3. Most nicknames are insults, but this one was a trap. François Duvalier, the terrifying dictator of Haiti, called himself Papa Doc. It sounds cute, like a friendly village physician who gives you lollipops. And he used to be a doctor, but do not let that fool you. He used this cozy, grandfatherly image to mask a brutal regime steeped in fear. He literally dressed like a voodoo spirit of death and convinced the locals that he had supernatural powers. His secret police were not just thugs, they were branded as bogeymen who could steal your soul. Calling himself Papa Doc was twisted genius. It forced the nation to address their nightmare with a term of endearment. It is marketing at its absolute darkest. 4. This is the ultimate example of fake it until you make it. The man who conquered half the known world was born Temujin, which is a perfectly fine name, but it does not exactly scream global domination. So he gave himself a promotion. He took the title Genghis Khan. Historians debate the exact translation, but it effectively means universal ruler or oceanic ruler. Just think about the ego on this guy. He looked at a world full of kings and emperors and said, "No, I am the ruler of everything," basically comparing himself to the limitless ocean. It was an audacious claim that actually came true. He shed his tribal identity to become a force of nature. It is hands down the most successful rebranding campaign in human history. 5. If you think modern politics is dirty, wait until you hear about Constantine V. This Byzantine emperor was a skilled general, but his enemies hated him so much they gave him the nickname Copronymus. That is fancy Greek for the dung-named. Legend says that as a baby, he had a little accident in the holy water during his baptism. He pooped in the font. Did it actually happen? Who knows? But his rivals seized that story and never let it go. Imagine being a grown man, leading armies and running an empire, while everyone calls you the poop guy because of something you allegedly did in diapers. It proves that once the mud, or in this case the dung, gets thrown, it stays there forever. 6. We all know Henry VIII was a big spender, but eventually the cash ran out. To keep funding his wars and lifestyle, he started running a scam on his own people by debasing the currency. He minted coins made of cheap copper and just coated them with a thin layer of silver. The problem? Henry had a massive nose on his coin portrait. As the coins circulated and rubbed against each other, the silver wore off on the highest point first, his schnoz. Suddenly, The King of England looked like he had a glowing red clown nose on every single shilling. His subjects relentlessly mocked him as Old Coppernose. It was a daily reminder to every peasant that their majestic king was literally cheap and rubbing off right before their eyes. 7. You use this guy's nickname every single day without realizing it. Harald Gormson was a Viking king famous for uniting Denmark and Norway. He was also famous for having a gross, dead tooth that looked dark blue or black, earning him the name Bluetooth. Flash forward 1,000 years to 1997. Engineers at Intel needed a code name for a new tech that would unite devices, just like Harald united tribes. A history nerd on the team suggested Bluetooth as a placeholder. They meant to change it later, but the name stuck. So now, every time you pair your headphones or sync your car, you are technically paying homage to a Viking warlord's rotting dental hygiene. History is weird. 8. Martin van Buren is usually a footnote in history class, but he gave the world the most popular word in the English language. He was from a town called Kinderhook, New York, so his supporters called him Old Kinderhook. During his election campaign, they formed OK clubs and used OK as a shorthand for all correct or good. Van Buren actually lost the election miserably, but the slogan took on a life of its own. It spread from political rallies to everyday slang and eventually global domination. So whenever you text someone a quick, "Okay," you are not just agreeing with them. You are accidentally shouting out a failed political campaign from the 19th century. It is the most successful accidental legacy of all time. 9. Imagine if we forgot a modern president's name and just called him President Hoodie, because he really liked sweatshirts. That is exactly what happened to the Roman Emperor Caracalla. His real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but he was obsessed with a specific Gallic hooded cloak called a caracalla. He wore it so much and forced his elite guards to wear it that it became his entire personality. It is hilarious because this guy wasn't a fashion influencer. He was a bloodthirsty psychopath who murdered his own brother. Yet history didn't brand him the fratricide or the butcher. Nope, we remember him as the cloak guy. It is the ultimate proof that you can be a terrifying monster, but if your outfit is loud enough, that is all people will talk about for the next 2,000 years. 10. Before the internet, we had French caricaturists. King Louis-Philippe I learned this the hard way when he was destroyed by a drawing of a piece of fruit. A satirist noticed the king's saggy jowls and pointy head looked exactly like a pear. He drew it, and bam, a 19th century viral meme was born. The nickname, the Pear King, spread like wildfire because it perfectly captured how the public saw him: soft, bloated, and kind of dull. The government panicked and tried to ban the drawings, which was a huge mistake. They essentially declared war on fruit, and they lost. By trying to censor the pear, they just made everyone laugh harder. It goes to show, once the public decides your head looks like produce, your political career is officially toast. 11. Some nicknames tell a story, but this one just leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Meet Wilfred the Hairy, the noble founder of Catalonia. That is his official title, the Hairy. History never actually explains where the hair was. Was he rocking a beard that touched his toes? Did he have a back like a shag carpet? Or was he the pioneer of the unibrow? We will never know, and that makes it infinitely worse. This man was a political heavyweight who shaped a region of Europe, yet his legacy is entirely defined by his follicle density. Imagine achieving greatness, founding a dynasty, and going down in history sounding like a circus attraction or a misunderstood Sasquatch. It really makes you appreciate the invention of the razor. 12. We call Charles VI of France the Mad, but that word does not do him justice. This poor guy suffered from a delusion that he was literally made of glass. Not metaphorically, he genuinely believed that if he bumped into a table, he would shatter into a million royal shards. He refused to let anyone touch him and even had iron rods sewn into his clothes to structurally reinforce his fragile body. Imagine the stress of being his servant. Every interaction was a high-stakes game of human Jenga, where one clumsy move could break the monarch. It sounds funny, but it paralyzed the entire French government. You cannot exactly run a war or negotiate treaties when the commander-in-chief is terrified of sitting down too hard. 13. History is basically a high school locker room, and Pepin the Short is the victim. This guy was a beast. He overthrew a failing dynasty, became the king of the Franks, and built a massive power base in Europe. He was a legitimately great ruler, but because he wasn't exactly an NBA player, history branded him the Short for eternity. The ultimate slap in the face? His son was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who was famous for being unusually tall and handsome. So Pepin did all the heavy lifting to build the empire, only to be remembered as the tiny dad of the really hot tall guy. He is the historical equivalent of a stepladder for his son's greatness. Talk about getting the short end of the stick. 14. You know him as a depraved lunatic who wanted to make his horse a politician, but his name is actually adorable. Caligula wasn't his real name. It was a childhood nickname meaning little boot. When he was a toddler, his dad took him on military campaigns, and the soldiers dressed him in a tiny, cute uniform with miniature army boots. Everyone went, "Oh, look at little boot," and the name stuck. It is the most jarring contrast in history. We use a sweet nursery rhyme name for a man who grew up to be a sadist, a murderer, and a sexual predator. It is like finding out that the villain in a horror movie goes by the name Snuggle Muffin. It just makes the horror even creepier. 15. Talk about failing to live up to family expectations. Selim II was the son of Suleiman the Magnificent. But while his dad was busy conquering the world, Selim was busy conquering the royal wine cellar. He earned the title Selim the Drunkard, and he worked hard for it. He famously never went to battle, preferring to command the party instead of the army. His death was the perfect tragic comedy. Legend says he wasn't killed by an assassin or a sword, but by a wet floor. He allegedly slipped in a bathhouse while drunkenly chasing a servant girl and cracked his skull. He lived by the bottle and quite literally died by slipping on the tiles. It is a cautionary tale. Greatness is hereditary, but liver failure is earned. 16. Most kings get names based on their courage or wisdom. Henry IV of Castile got a name based on his medical chart. He is known forever as Henry the Impotent. In the 15th century, a king's main job was making babies to secure the dynasty. Henry struggled with that. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was a political disaster. When his wife finally had a daughter, everyone whispered that it was actually the work of a nobleman, not the king. This led to a brutal civil war because nobody respected a monarch who couldn't perform in the bedroom. It is harsh, but it proves that in medieval politics, your ability to rule was directly tied to your ability to reproduce. His legacy wasn't written in laws, but in awkward silence. 17. Most dictators are content with being called president, but Idi Amin of Uganda was his own personal hype man on a cosmic scale. He didn't just want a title, he wanted a whole paragraph. He officially styled himself as His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire. You have to admire the sheer audacity of claiming dominion over every single tuna sandwich and squirrel on the planet. And the part about conquering the British Empire? That was just a straight-up lie to troll the Queen. It is the ultimate example of small man syndrome manifesting as a title so long you would need an extra sheet of paper just to sign a check. 18. Public relations in the Middle Ages were tricky because your nickname depended entirely on who was writing the history book. Take King Bolesław II of Poland. If you were one of his soldiers or allies who got paid in gold, you called him Bolesław the Generous. He was the best boss ever. But if you were his enemy, or just someone who annoyed him on a Tuesday, he was Bolesław the Cruel. It is a perfect encapsulation of medieval politics. To be a generous king to your friends, you usually had to be absolutely ruthless to someone else to get the money. His legacy is a coin toss. He was either a benevolent philanthropist or a bloodthirsty tyrant, and there was absolutely no middle ground. 19. Usually, when a ruler is called the Strong, it means they are good at arm wrestling. Augustus II of Poland took it to a ridiculous extreme. This guy was basically a comic book character. He would entertain guests by snapping solid iron horseshoes in half with his bare hands, just to show off. But the nickname had a second, saucier meaning. His stamina wasn't just for bending metal, it was for the bedroom. Historians estimate this man fathered over 300 illegitimate children. That is not a typo. 300. Augustus the Strong wasn't just running a kingdom, he was personally populating it. He is the only monarch in history who could field an entire battalion of soldiers made up entirely of his own biological offspring. 20. In the Game of Thrones of real history, you don't want to be a lion. You want to be a fox. Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, was known as the Red Fox. Sure, he had a magnificent ginger beard that made him easy to spot in a crowd, but the name was really a warning label. He was the ultimate political trickster. While other kings were bashing heads together, Sigismund was weaving complex webs of diplomacy, outsmarting his rivals, and manipulating the church. He was charming, slippery, and always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Calling him the Red Fox was a sign of begrudging respect from his enemies, who knew that if they shook his hand, they should probably count their fingers afterwards. 21. Vikings are supposed to have terrifying names like Bloodaxe or Skullcrusher. Magnus III of Norway got stuck with Magnus Barefoot. It sounds like he was a hippie, but he was actually just a fashion victim. After a military campaign in Scotland and Ireland, Magnus fell in love with Gaelic fashion. He ditched his warm, sensible Norse trousers and started wearing kilts and tunics that left his legs exposed to the freezing cold. He loved the look so much he forced his men to wear it too. Imagine a boatload of shivering Vikings returning to Norway, looking like they just came back from a tropical vacation. His people were so confused by his lack of pants that they immortalized his questionable wardrobe choices forever. 22. Branding is everything, even for assassins. In the mountains of Persia, Hassani Saba created a persona so terrifying that he didn't need a crown. He was known simply as the Old Man of the Mountain. It sounds like a character from a spooky campfire story, and that was the point. He led the Order of Assassins and convinced the world that he was an ancient, almost supernatural wizard living in an impregnable fortress. Kings and crusaders who had never even seen his face were terrified of him. By using this mysterious, ghostly title instead of a normal name, he transformed himself from a local warlord into a mythological boogeyman. It proves that sometimes remaining anonymous is the biggest power move you can make. 23. If you saw a Viking warrior named Ivar the Boneless coming at you, you would be confused before you were killed. This is one of the most debated nicknames in history. Some historians think he had a disease like osteogenesis imperfecta, meaning his bones were brittle and he had to be carried into battle on a shield, commanding his troops like a fragile mastermind. Others think it was a compliment, implying he was double-jointed and moved with a snake-like fluidity that made him impossible to hit. Either way, it is terrifying. He was either a cripple who was so scary he led armies anyway, or he was a human pretzel of death. It is a name that sounds like a curse, and for the English, it definitely was. 24. Sometimes you get a bad nickname just because your enemies are too lazy to learn your language. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn was a legendary Welsh king who united his country and fought the English. But the English nobles couldn't be bothered to pronounce Gruffydd properly. In Old English, a word for dog was cur, or ci. Since Gruffydd sounded vaguely similar to their ears, they just started calling him the dog's head, or simply the dog. It wasn't because he barked or bit. It was just linguistic laziness combined with disrespect. Imagine uniting an entire nation and becoming a hero, only to have your neighbors name you after a household pet because they flunked their foreign language classes. It is the ultimate historical insult. 25. If you think modern politicians are manipulative, meet the Grandmaster of Gaslighting, King Louis XI of France. While other kings wanted cool names like the Lionheart or the Conqueror, Louis earned the creepy but accurate title, the Universal Spider. He didn't care about glory on the battlefield. He viewed Europe as a giant web and himself as the predator sitting silently in the center. He spun complex conspiracies, bought off enemies, and trapped rivals in legal and political tangles until they couldn't move. It is a terrifying nickname because it implies he was always watching, always waiting, and always 10 steps ahead. History remembers him not as a warrior, but as a guy who paralyzed an entire continent just by pulling a few strings from his bedroom. 26. Since we already covered Genghis Khan, let's talk about a ruler with a name that sounds like a grocery list. Meet Ivaylo of Bulgaria, the only peasant in history to rise up and become an emperor, only to be mocked as Ivaylo the Cabbage. Before he led a massive uprising and took the throne, he was a humble pig herder who allegedly grew vegetables. The nobility absolutely hated that a commoner was wearing the crown, so they refused to use his real royal title and exclusively called him the Cabbage or the Lettuce to remind everyone of his muddy roots. Imagine conquering a nation and defeating armies, only for your enemies to nickname you after a salad ingredient. It is a petty, leafy insult that has stuck to him for 700 years. 27. International diplomacy is hard enough without bodily fluids getting involved. King Alfonso IX of Leon was a powerful ruler, but he had a slight anger management issue that earned him the grossest nickname in royal history, the Slobberer. When Alfonso got mad, which happened often, he would enter a blind rage and literally start foaming at the mouth. We are not talking about a little spit. Historical chronicles describe him drooling uncontrollably like a rabid animal. Imagine being a foreign ambassador trying to negotiate a peace treaty while the King of Leon is screaming and spraying the table with royal saliva. It is hard to maintain an aura of majesty when your court knows to bring an umbrella every time you start yelling. 28. The Middle Ages were all about jagged swords, heavy armor, and crushing your enemies. Then there was Wenceslaus II of Bohemia, who decided he would rather be an emo artist. History remembers him as the Poet King. While his neighbors were busy invading each other, Wenceslaus was sitting in his castle, sharpening his quill and writing courtly love songs. He turned his court into a cultural sanctuary for artists and dreamers, which was incredibly rare for a ruler of his stature. It sounds charming, but in the brutal game of medieval thrones, being known as the guy who writes verses about flowers is a bold choice. He proved that you can run a kingdom and still have the soul of a misunderstood creative writer. 29. In the Byzantine Empire, if you wanted to fire an emperor, you didn't just impeach him, you cut off his nose. This happened to Justinian II. His rivals sliced off his nose to make him imperfect and ineligible to rule, dubbing him rhinomatos, or the slit-nosed. Most men would retire. Justinian? He went to the jeweler. He commissioned a solid gold prosthetic nose, raised an army, and marched back to Constantinople to reclaim his throne. Imagine the terror of seeing your former emperor storming the gates, wearing a glittering golden nose where his face used to be. It is the ultimate revenge story. He didn't just come back. He turned his mutilation into the most terrifying fashion statement in political history. 30. King James I of England holds the title for the most backhanded compliment ever recorded. A French official famously called him the wisest fool in Christendom. It was a perfect psychological profile. James was a genius on paper. He wrote scholarly books on theology, politics, and even demonology. He could debate any professor in Europe. But when it came to common sense or reading a room, absolute zero. He was the classic example of someone with maximum intelligence and minimum wisdom. He could lecture you on the divine right of kings for hours in Latin, but he couldn't tie his own shoes without causing a diplomatic incident. It is a reminder that being book smart does not stop you from being a total disaster in the real world. 31. Sometimes a nickname is a weapon designed to destroy your manhood. King Magnus IV of Sweden was the target of a vicious smear campaign, where enemies called him Magnus Smek. In Swedish, Smek means caress or kiss. It sounds sweet, but in the hyper-masculine world of the 14th century, it was a slur implying he was weak, effeminate, and arguably gay. His rivals used this nickname to spread rumors that he was too soft to rule and was spending a bit too much time with his young male favorites. It worked. The name stuck, undermining his authority and painting him as a fragile lover rather than a strong fighter. It shows that bullying world leaders with playground insults is a tradition as old as time. 32. Finally, let's honor the man with the most relatable priorities in human history. Leszek I of Poland, also known as Leszek the White, was asked by the Pope to join a crusade to the Holy Land. It was a religious duty, but Leszek said no. His official excuse? There was no beer in Palestine. He wrote a letter explaining that he and his Polish knights were used to drinking ale, and since the Holy Land only had wine and water, they would simply be too miserable to fight effectively. He literally turned down a holy war because the beverage menu wasn't to his liking. You have to respect a leader who knows exactly what his army needs to function, even if it means ghosting the Pope for a pint. We just dragged 32 leaders through the mud, but I definitely missed some gems. Here is a challenge. Who is the one ruler with a nickname so bizarre or offensive that it is a crime I left them off this list? I know you history buffs are screaming a specific name at your screen right now, so drop it in the comments and prove me wrong. Smash that subscribe button for more history that hurts, and I will see you in the next one.